All right. Beauty from the Shelf is a podcast that gives early stage founders the tips and tricks to grow from 0 to 20 million. I'm your host, Monique Benoit, and today I'm actually serving up a solo episode filled with advice on one of my absolutely favorite topics, which is storytelling. But before we get into our episode, I'd like to take a moment to thank our podcast sponsor, the Emerson Group. The Emerson Group is a longtime partner for health, beauty, and wellness brands in the retail industry. I'd like to thank the Emerson Group for allowing me to continue to share tips and tricks to founders through their support of Beauty from the Shelf. Now let's go ahead and get into today's episode. I know that I'm going solo. I'm going to try my best to keep things energetic. Okay, guys? So stick with me. I'm talking about one of my favorite things as someone who works in brand strategy and also has worked as a buyer, and that is crafting your story as a brand. I talk about this all the time on LinkedIn. I talk about this whenever I talk to brands. How you tell your story is absolutely crucial in getting your point across to your ideal consumer. This is one of the ways that you cut through the noise. And if you all can recall from when you were younger, you might have heard a parent who said something like, it's not just what you say, but it's how you say it. Well, that is true in CPG branding. It is not just what you say, but how you say it. Are you coming with an energetic lens? Are you coming with a lens that is a little bit moody and subtle? Are you coming with a lens that is traditional and expected? All of those things very well can be okay, very well can be successful, but it's a matter of looking at all of those slices, each of those slices as you dissect and assess your brand. So let's get into a couple of questions that I like to ask myself when I am working with brands and talking to them about who their brand is. I think that telling your story is more about validating the proof that's out there. You have an idea that, hey, there's this problem that my brand is ultimately solving. And in telling your story, you're sharing the parts about your brand that are interesting because everyone has a story to tell. But then how are you crafting the parts that folks haven't heard before? So here are some starter questions to get you going if you want to ask yourself, am I telling the best story possible? First, what is the reason for starting your brand? And the reason for starting your brand is a fantastic way to start at where you can tell your brand story because it can hit on some points of vulnerability. And points of vulnerability are really important places for humans to connect with each other. One of the things that I love to say is how can we make this sticky? And that vulnerability, that point of connection that's past something that is on the surface is a fantastic way to connect. The next question that I like to ask is, who is going to buy your brand? At the end of the day, if you're trying to make some money, you need a buyer for your brand. And the next thing that I say after who is going to buy your brand is what problem does that ideal customer have? I like to ask what problems does my ideal customer have as an open-ended question so that I can not only address the problems that my product that I'm creating is solving, but so that I can also potentially see ties in how I want to talk to my consumer. And I can tie that in with the brand storytelling that I'm doing or in the marketing campaigns that I'm getting after. So for example, I am a melanated Black woman. And so growing up, I was unable to actually buy foundation from the drugstore or from mass retailers because they didn't have enough dark enough shades for someone with my skin complexion. It's much better now, but that's how it was then. So if someone were to say, what problem does your ideal customer have? And someone like a Rihanna is coming out with a Fenty Beauty, she might say, well, this customer is going to everyday stores and is unable to find a shade that matches them. Now, while that's disappointing because this means that they can't find foundation, what other things might come with that? Maybe there's some things where you feel like you don't necessarily belong. Maybe there's some issues that come in with that make you feel like you aren't seen. And so maybe there's some additional marketing that you can do to show people with darker shades to validate that, hey, yes, you do belong. Hey, yes, you can be here. That's obviously something that we're seeing more and more, but you can see how connecting these ties and asking these questions of what problems does your ideal customer have can tie to some bigger things that can generate a stronger tie between the ideal customer and the product that you are ultimately coming out with. The last question that I have is, what problem is your brand solving? So hopefully after asking what problems does the ideal customer have, one of those problems is one that your brand is solving. But either way, tying all of that together is going to be a great way for you to start telling your brand story. I thought that it would be helpful for us to go through an example of a brand that recently launched at Ulta Beauty. It's a brand that I had spoken with years ago when I was doing a retailer development day prep, actually when I was still working with the Emerson Group. And the brand is Hana Beauty, and they sell skincare products that are ethically sourced. So if I just start at the top, Hana Beauty started with the idea of wanting to offer transparent ingredients. If I start off at the top question, why did you start your brand? Hana Beauty started with the idea of wanting to offer transparent ingredients and transparent sourcing with skincare products that yielded results. So we can see that ethical sourcing, transparency around ingredients was a core piece to this brand. So when we think about who's going to buy products from this brand, we can see that consumers who might care about sustainability, consumers who might care about transparency. The founder happens to work with a co-op in Ghana to source the key ingredients. And that co-op happens to be a women-owned or a women's co-op. So perhaps the people who are going to buy Hana Beauty products are people who support women's issues and women's empowerment. So then I start to think about core category age groups. Millennials might connect to that. Gen Z might connect with that. Gen X might connect with that. And I say, what type of price bracket, what type of earnings are the people who connect with these ideas in? Well, they might be folks who are high earners, six figures, that have disposable income, who like to support brands that make them feel good. They're thinking about sustainability. But you might also still connect with people who don't necessarily have as much disposable income, or making $50,000 a year or $60,000 a year, but they are intentional about using that disposable income on brands and products that they know are advancing issues that are important to them. Who is going to buy this beauty product? And now we think next, what problems does this customer experience? Now, this might depend on which slice of the consumer pie you're looking at, but you can again see that depending on if you're going after a millennial who may grew up with so many things, seeing how the world is changing and is being impacted by globalization, how they might say, wow, I really love that I know exactly where this is coming from because it helps me feel like I'm doing things to reduce my environmental impact on the world. And that is a core value that's important to me as a millennial. Or alternatively, someone who's Gen Z might say, hey, I really care a lot about knowing exactly where things are sourced from. And so that's something that's really important to me. And I want to make sure that all of the products that I use are sourced from places that I know who the people are. I know the organizations. That's something that's important to me. These are problems, perceived problems, or actual problems that these folks have that this brand is essentially solving. And then ultimately, what problem is Hana Beauty solving? Well, they're providing, again, results-driven skincare that is ethically sourced. So you can see how in walking through each of these storytelling elements, we're really getting to who the consumer is, what's important to them, and what parts of the story need to be told so that you can really tap into that consumer and understand what parts we want to amplify What parts are still part of the story because it's there, but maybe it doesn't need to be amplified? And then what parts of the story might be tertiary parts that we tell in our social media, or what parts we might tell in some of the influencer campaigns that we have. So that's just an example of telling your story. As you brands are out there and you're figuring out how to tell your story, I encourage you to start with those 4 questions that I shared a little bit earlier. Write down those answers and then just start to dig deep. Start to ask yourself more and more about who that customer is, and ask yourself why this product that you're solving, why your brand is important to them, and why it's important right now. Why in this moment in time is your brand something that your ideal consumer wants to connect with, needs to connect with? What are you doing in the current moment that makes it undeniable that you and that core consumer, aka what is currently happening in the current culture, in this current moment in time, that makes it unequivocal that that ideal consumer and your brand need to get together and make a connection? I know that it might sound a little bit surreal to talk about connecting with your consumer like that, but that's really what brands are. They are intimate connections with actual people and brands. I mean, that's how you generate loyalty and generate a brand that's going to be around for a while. That's going to be something that people consistently come back to and say, this is something that I will continue to use and come back to time and time again. Okay. With that being said, I'm going to go ahead and wrap the show. Wanted to keep it short and sweet since it's just me today, but I'd like to thank you for listening into today's episode. As always, if you found this episode helpful, please leave me a review on Apple Podcasts. It helps ensure that more people get to see this podcast. And if you found this episode helpful, I encourage you to share it with a friend, and I'll catch you on the next episode. Bye.